Pagan Autogeny looks extremely promising on the surface. Just take a look at the main section of the description. 1,000 worlds surround our own, composed of bits and bytes. When they die, where do they go? What secrets do they hide? Stumble ye, wayfarer, through the wreckage of a dim MMO. Pagan Autogeny is an experimental first-person open-world role-playing game set in the digital ruins of a largely abandoned MMORPG. It is heavily inspired by long-forgotten bargain-bin 1990s adventure games and by a general ethos of user-hostile design. Tags for the game include horror, surreal, and atmospheric. The game seems promising at first. It runs only in a 4:3 aspect ratio, and it starts up with an authentic-looking splash screen accompanied by MIDI music that invokes old-school MMOs like RuneScape. The skills and inventory screens are unpolished and are mapped annoyingly, though authentically, to the I and K keys. The game's textures are all very grainy and pixelated, and a chromatic aberration effect covers the whole screen. Unfortunately, that's the extent of this game's faithfulness to the genre. Gameplay-wise, it is nothing like an old MMO. The game is played from a first-person perspective, the lighting effects are noticeably high fidelity, despite the attempts to lower the graphical quality, and a lot of real-time combat is involved. The further into the game you get, the more you realize that it fails to deliver on its premise. As Steam user Gambolier put it in the negative review, a game that was actually about stumbling through the wreckage of a dim MMO would have been interesting. Speaking of gameplay, what little of it that exists isn't very compelling. The game revolves around a single puzzle, and it's not even a good one. Little instruction is given to the player, and the sole challenge is in deciphering the game's cryptic success and failure messages given on interactions with objects. This might be compelling if not for the fact that the game only has a few major points of interest in it, and the player is bound to discover their proper interactions with each other just by aimlessly running between them and trying to interact. Alongside the singular puzzle, the game also offers lackluster combat. There is no depth to it. The player simply shoots at enemies and dodges their projectiles. Health regenerates over time, and every boss's attacks can be avoided well enough by simply walking in a circle. Certain items can make boss fights go faster, but the game is not difficult without these items, only more tedious. On top of all this, the game artificially pads out the experience by placing main objectives at the end of mazes and placing a dense layer of fog in front of the player at almost all times. Not only is much of the game spent aimlessly wandering, but much of that wandering is spent completely disoriented, walking to remote places only to find that they contain nothing of value. The game does advertise itself as being user-hostile, but that acknowledgement alone doesn't make the hostility enjoyable, nor does it add anything at all to the experience. The hostility has no apparent artistic significance. Despite the poor gameplay and lack of a cohesive theme, the game might be saved if it still delivered an interesting meta-horror experience. Unfortunately, it falls flat in this department as well. Though it offers a few unsettling moments, most of the game is spent aimlessly wandering through environments that are devoid of anything interesting to see. Instead of the eerie emptiness the premise promises, these spaces come across as simply being content sparse. As mentioned before, there is only a few major points of interest required to complete the game, yet the game is loaded with buildings, rooms, mazes, and open spaces that offer little of value. Silence and emptiness can be an effective tool in horror. A game or movie can lull the player into a false sense of security only to rip it away from them unexpectedly, creating a quick and sudden burst of terror. For a slower burn, a game might use context to make the player feel powerless to a looming threat, which puts the player on edge by making every calm moment feel unsafe. Pagan does neither of these. The player, though aimless at first and perhaps a bit fearful due to the game's description, quickly gets a sense of what's going on and spends almost the entire remainder of the game squarely in control. The reasonable thing to do would be to abruptly violate the player's sense of security, but this never happens. As soon as the player has a grasp on the gameplay of all of the game's psychological power is gone, and the player is left with little more than a cheap puzzle, bad combat, and a lot of empty space. Finally, at the end of the game, the payoff is so small that it makes everything that came before feel like an exercise in futility. The player's effort and patience is rewarded with nothing but a confusing poem. Any real exploration of gender, as many reviewers have lauded, is present only in whatever poem accompanies the ending that the player has found, and these poems never seem to offer much depth. Critics might object that because I didn't find every secret ending or because I didn't engage with the small ARG associated with the game, that I have no space to speak of its merits, or that I didn't get it. Maybe this is justified. If someone else had a better experience with this game than I did, then I don't want to take that away from them. However, when a player must go searching for substance in order to find any, I think the game has already failed. It's okay for media to demand non-trivial effort on the part of the consumer, but I expect such media to direct the consumer towards its own substance, especially when it's a game that costs $6.99 and markets itself by its own merits on which it fails to deliver. Does Pagan Autogeny do anything right? By its own goals, sure. The game describes itself as an exercise in aesthetic maximalism, and this comes through in the pointlessly large environments. The game does have a small handful of genuinely unsettling moments, however sparse they may be. I counted 6 in my entire playthrough. And of course, the game is constantly punctuated by the proudly professed ethos of user-hostile design. Ultimately, the game fails to deliver on even many of its own goals, and its few successes don't amount to an engaging experience for the player. Pagan Autogeny is noteworthy as an experimental and unorthodox title, but unless you want to lap up the flavorless scraps of some developer's personal artistic experimentation, it's not worth playing. If you want an engaging meta-horror puzzle game, I recommend both Inscription and Pony Island. If you want a game that's artistically experimental, I'd recommend The Beginner's Guide. If you want a horror-themed exploration of a dead online game, I'd recommend No Players Online. Any one of these games will be a better use of your time than Pagan Autogeny.